Right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. It's a bit wet and so on outside, so I appreciate that you made it in the rain. My name's Caylie Jeffery, and I've come up from Brisbane with my friend over here, Lynn. Oh no, well, we're here together. So Lynn over there and I have been involved in this huge project called Under the Lino. Some of you might have heard a bit about it on the radio on the weekend or seen bits and pieces floating around on social media. But essentially, I'm here today to tell you the story about what happened just over a year ago when I did some sharing on social media about some documents that I found. So please feel free to stop me and ask questions along the way, or save your questions to the end. I'm here for as long as you need to talk about the project. So do I just use this here? So, no, that's not going to work. We'll just use the little clicker, shall we? Yeah, there we go. So I live in Milton in Brisbane, and my husband and I bought this very, very dilapidated Queenslander in 1990, when was it? 6. I'm trying to remember. In 1996, and it was absolutely revolting. It was completely fallen apart. The tenants who'd been living in it for the 6 years prior to us moving in had turned it into really a dump. There was animal feces on the carpets, there were broken car bodies all over the backyard, there were broken sewage pipes dripping onto the furniture. It was really quite horrendous, and the fun fact of the sign outside said ripe for renovation, which is some of the real estate humour that they use to sell these houses to would-be renovators. And we were poor at the time. We only just scraped enough money together to buy a house, and it was all we could afford. It was the busiest, worst street in the busiest suburb, but there it is. We were hardworking people, and we were quite happy to, you know, pull this house together again. So that is actually the same house just here on the corner in the 1974 floods. So every time it floods in Milton, our house misses out by one house, and it did exactly that in 2011. So this is kind of the state of the house when we first bought it. It was divided into 2 flats, and it just looked as if nobody had ever cleaned it. And it had layers and layers of the linoleum. This was sort of something from the 60s and 70s, we think, but underneath there were other layers. This was the bathroom. It was just horrible. And I didn't want to buy the house. My husband saw the value in doing it up, but I said no way. So this is what we ripped out of the house when we first put it together. There's actually a skip under here. And it had all the old mattresses, all the furniture was still left in it, and we took down all of the walls that had separated the house into a couple of flats. So we found lots of things while we were doing our investigations our renovations. The old bottles, some of which still had this one here I think still had Vaseline in it, and there were all sorts of bits and pieces that we found. And my mum had said to us, make sure when you're lifting back the old lino, stripping it out, keep an eye out for old newspapers and things like that, because people used to line the floors with old newspapers. Who in the room has lifted up old newspapers, old lino and found newspapers? Yep, and they're, yep. So in the kitchen, when we lifted up this beautiful 1970s lino, we discovered 3 bank books and 4 £5 notes that are going around the room at the moment. This is them. They were dating back to the 1940s and 50s. And this was at a time where we were really, really busy. We could see the value in the documents and the money, but we didn't have time to do anything about it. It was in the early 90s, mid-90s. Internet had just started. We didn't really know how to use it yet. I certainly didn't have time to go and investigate who these people were. So I tucked the money away for about 20 years, and I discovered it again just over a year ago. there was over £2,000 worth of money in the open accounts and £20 in cash, some coins as well. So what I did was, when I rediscovered the money in 2017, I thought, how am I going to find out who these people were in the quickest possible way? Because again, I was a mum with 2 small children, didn't have a lot of time. So I put a post on Old Brisbane Album, which is an historical sort of nostalgic Facebook page, which now has about 30,000 members. There's an Old Sydney album, an Old Melbourne album and so on, where people share photographs of times gone by. And I put this post up and said, found this old money in these bank books, suspect that housewives were squirreling them away. What do you think I should do with it all? And what happened next was absolutely phenomenal. It really, over 1,000 people gave me their ideas and their thoughts and their reasons for why the money was under the Lino, who these people could have been, and what we should do next. And I say we because the community took this project on like they owned it from the very beginning, and I was so happy to share it with them. And Lynn Cox, who's come up today, she was actually the first person, I think, to respond to that post. And Lynn has been with me for over a year now, helping to discover all of the answers to the questions that we posed. So now there's 1,388 people as of yesterday in the Facebook group for Under the Lino. So we have this great mystery, okay? So we've got the books, we've got the money. We need to find out, this is what the people wanted, who were the original owners? Why did they hide the money? Why did they have so much money? The house was in a working class neighbourhood. It wasn't for wealthy people. £2,000 at the time, how much was that worth? Enough to buy 4 brand new houses. £20 in cash was about a month's wages. So someone had tucked away a month's wages in these account books ready to deposit to the bank next time. Huge amounts of money. There were 3 passbooks. I'll tell you about the different names and people in passbooks in a minute. But one of the passbooks had a different address in the back of it and a different name to the people who used to own the house. So all these mysterious questions that we had to answer. So with Lynn and all of those other people, we had all of these wonderful resources at our fingertips now that the internet had come about, and the places like the State Archives and the State Library of Queensland, local libraries, we had opened the gates up for people to do their own historical research. And I really depended on a lot of people in the group to help me with these resources, because I hated history as a child. I thought it was really boring, and so the thought of doing this kind of research really, worried me because I had no idea where to start. But really, we pretty much covered every possible way of getting information in the last year to find the answers to the question. So we went through, do you guys all know Trove? Has everybody in here heard of Trove? So Trove is really one of the most interesting places you can hang out on the internet if you're into family history. It is where they've collected all newspapers and publications from years gone by, all the articles. You can just put in searches and find lots of relatives and friends and events that happen in times gone by and read up all about them. So we really depended on Trove for a lot of our answers. Word of mouth. Unfortunately, if I had actually done some research 20 years ago when we first discovered the money, my next door neighbour was in his 80s. He was the old milkman for the area. He would have known all about the people who lived in the house. But sadly, I wasn't smart enough to talk to him about that stuff back in the time. So basically, we brought in everybody and anybody who wanted to find out more about this or to help us, and we started that Facebook group. So this is some examples of some of the people that joined us on the investigation. So this is an example of people coming over to my house to have tea and discuss, what to do next and what was going on. There's Lynn up there in the middle. That was our first meeting where we met to discuss the money. Hugh Lunn, do you guys remember Hugh Lunn? So he's up there. He helped a little bit with some information about the 50s. We've done some trips and tours. Boggo Road Jail here. Cheryl Palmer, is Cheryl Palmer's best friend in the room? Robin? Not, she was going to come today. But, and the Morcombe family. Do you guys know Daniel Morcombe's story? So the Morcombe family is also involved in this tale in some very interesting ways. So it's a very eclectic bunch of people, and together we worked hard to look into basically these people here. So 3 bank books. The first bank book was owned by Arthur and Eleanor Webster. The second bank book was just Eleanor Webster. I'll just talk about those for the moment. This is the first one. It was for the address of my house. So that's okay. We figured out that Arthur and Eleanor used to live in our house. The dates went from the 40s to the early 50s. It was a Brisbane City branch in this particular book, and the balance was kept at around £500. If it ever went over, someone would take a little bit of money out just to keep that balance at about 500. This is very important. Lots of research found that Arthur Webster was a train driver, a steam train driver for Queensland Rail. He drove the old locomotives. Luckily for us, Arthur Webster was not a very nice man. And because of that, he is still known in Queensland Rail, even though he died in 1976. He was born in the 1800s and he started at Queensland Rail in 1906, and so he worked until you know the mid-50s, fortunately for us, we were able to interview people who were still alive who had actually worked with him, and were able to give us some information about him that helped with our investigation. He lived alone after his wife Eleanor died in our house, you know that he caused 2 deaths while he was a train driver. We found that information out on Trove, so articles in the paper and the archives. So Lynn actually went to the archives to do some investigating there as well. So we're gathering a picture of this family with all of this information and giving ourselves sort of a bit of a look into why the money might have been hidden away. The second bank book was owned by a lady called Eleanor Webster, Arthur's wife. We don't have a lot of information about Eleanor because really, unless you were, as a woman in the 50s and 40s, unless you did anything particularly significant or notorious, you know, you weren't really seen as worthy of newspaper articles, which is probably just as well because there's some really dodgy articles back then. And we felt that she was probably the one who was managing the bank books. We discovered that Eleanor passed away in 1958, about 6 weeks after the last transaction in the bank books, and the money stayed hidden up until, you know, the 1990s. So we didn't think anybody else knew anything about it. So again, that same account, the balance was kept at about £500. It was at a different branch, and it was very unusual for a woman in those days to have her own account. So, you know, that was something for us to talk about. Now, we started looking into Eleanor Webster, finding out, you know, who she was and what we could find out about her. Her maiden name was Murphy. That was very important for us to discover leading up until the third bank book I'll tell you about. We found out that she died. She died when she was 72 years old. This was important because some of the information we knew about Arthur, people put together that maybe Arthur could have been violent at home and that maybe Eleanor was hiding money to cut and run from him. Then we found out that she was 72 when she passed away. The likelihood of her wanting to cut and run at 72 was pretty slim. But then we found out that she died at an address in Brisbane, right over the road from where Betty Shanks used to live. Who remembers the Betty Shanks murder? So that was very interesting for all of us. We sort of went off on a bit of a sideline and started investigating Betty Shanks. And when I talked to some children at the local state school about the story and asked them for ideas on why they thought, the money had been hidden and so on, they or some of them agreed that obviously Arthur Webster had killed Betty Shanks and stolen the money that she had had in her purse and put it in the account. They were brilliant. Their minds were really out of the box, So we also found out that by visiting cemeteries, looking at gravestones, we could see that the Websters had 2 children, one of whom died as an infant, and Morgan, who lived in the house for many years. So what we were actually doing was trying to find relatives so we could either give them the money back or give them access to any money that might have been in bank accounts, so we could, tell their story as well. So what we discovered, this is the gravestone that I found in the local Toowong cemetery that gave us the information that she had an infant son, Colin, and that she was the mother of Morgan. So we're like, Morgan, it might be, still part of the picture. He might have had children. Let's go down Morgan's sort of route. So we found out that he'd gone to the local schools, Brisbane Grammar School as well. Again, we were like, how did this kid go to grammar school when his dad was just working as a train driver, earning about £5 a week? But then we found this article that said he'd won a scholarship. So for every question we asked about these people, we were very quickly, as a group and a team, able to find the answers by really just pitching in ideas and doing little bits of research. Because of Trove, these newspapers that we were able to look at online, we discovered that Morgan Webster had been married and had had his marriage annulled in the 1930s because of inability to consummate. Now, we laugh today about how much people share on social media and, the whole selfie generation and the me thing. But really, back in those days with the newspapers of the time, the Tatler and all these horrible newspapers, they used to literally break into people's houses to take pictures of gentlemen pulling up their pants and putting their suspenders on and jumping over the back fence to catch people out in the act of having extramarital affairs so people could get divorced. Very simple, and very horrible. But an example of the horror of the articles is having Morgan's sexual behaviours splashed all over the place. So, unfortunately, the end of the Webster-Murphy line finished with Morgan and he never had any children. So that answered a question, are there any beneficiaries to this fortune? Also, the Commonwealth Bank had let us know that most of the money in those accounts had either been bequeathed through wills back to Arthur and Morgan or had gone into consolidated revenue. So that money wasn't actually available to get, but could have been made available had there been a relative who'd come forward. So who uses Ancestry.com in here? Has anyone had a bit of a play on that? Okay, so Lynn Cox has put a hand up and that's her up here. Lynn was the one who started this family tree for us about the Websters and the Murphys. And we were able to, all together, find more than 250 family members dating all the way back to the early 1800s when they came out from Ireland and Scotland. And this is a tiny little portion of the tree. It's absolutely enormous. And so in doing this, we were able to figure out who these people were. And then I did some radio interviews and some TV interviews. And the people who were related to the Websters and Murphys started to come out of the woodwork. They heard me on the radio and they're like, oh, I had an uncle or, so on, or I was related to them in some way. And they came forward and we were able to touch base and meet several relatives of the Murphy and the Webster family, as well as people who used to live in my house as tenants. They came forward as well. So that was brilliant. We did interviews for all these people. It was pretty special for us to find. The most significant was this gentleman here, Edwin Murphy, who was actually a first cousin, and he had the complete family history of the Murphy family for us. Also, we discovered that, who remembers Webster's biscuits? So Arthur Webster, the train driver, was the nephew of David Webster, who was the starter of Webster's Biscuit Factory. He was also the guy who started the Shingle Inn, and which still runs today in Brisbane and has several franchises. So this opened up this amazing kind of plethora of Brisbane and sort of outlying stories, because the family hailed from Ipswich. You'll find out in a minute that they also came from Maryborough. This is the connection that we have in Maryborough, which we were so excited about because it just extended. A lot of people in the group had come from Maryborough or knew things about Maryborough. And so Eleanor Webster's is actually paternal, beg your pardon, grandfather, Michael Murphy, originally came from Ireland. He moved to Ipswich when they came out to Australia, and he ended up spending his later years retiring in Maryborough with his daughter. So I don't know if any of those, Elizabeth Telfer, mean anybody to... We got some original Maryborough people in the room? Okay. So he died and was buried in the cemetery in 1918. So my job, after I leave you guys today with Lynn, is to go traversing Maryborough Cemetery looking for Michael Murphy's grave. So that was pretty exciting. The reason we needed to find out about Michael Murphy and go all the way back to the Maryborough connections was the third bank book. Okay, this is the bugbear of all of us. Who was Muriel White? Mrs. Muriel White's bank book was hidden underneath my Lino with an address in the back of it that said Bristol Street, West End. What on earth was her bank book doing there? It had over £1,000 in the account. It had never been closed. And as you can see here, somebody picked up at some point, someone in my art class, I think, that the name White was in a different hand to the name Mrs. Muriel. So these were all like crackling people's investigative juices, and we were all wondering, there were only deposits made into this account. Who was this Muriel White? So people started looking. There are a lot of Muriel Whites who lived up Maryborough way, I have to say, and we were put off the scent quite a few times. So this was our big investigation. This lady, we found out, was called Muriel. There was a Muriel Murphy who lived at 19 Bristol Street in West End. So Murphy, we got Eleanor Murphy, Muriel Murphy, maybe they were related. But she married someone called Horace Hill. She never married anybody else, and she died Mrs. Horace Hill. So why Mrs. Muriel White? What's all that about? And so we did a lot of investigating around this until we found out that Michael Murphy was the great-grandfather? No, grandfather of both of these women, and that they were first cousins. Okay. Lynn found this out because she paid for death certificates, were they? Or birth and marriage certificates from the BDM, and when we found out that they were actually related as cousins, what can anybody think of why, the relationship between hiding Muriel's money underneath the lino, and why would she be doing that? Anybody? Any thoughts? Yeah, okay, they could have been sisters. That was the original thought that we had, and or very close cousins when we found out they were cousins, and maybe Muriel might have been having difficulties with her marriage, and Eleanor was looking after her money, and so on and so forth. But we were never able to make the connection with the Muriel White. Why was she called that name? I recently had a professor come to the house to have a look at the bank books, and he reckons that the actual name, remember how it was a different hand, Muriel White, the White was, he thinks that they could have blotted out the original name because the ink wasn't permanent ink, and then rewritten another name there at some point. So there's a lot of discussion in the book about, what could have happened at that point. So to really help us with the investigation, it was very important that we got the history of the times. What were people doing in the 40s and 50s? Why were people hiding money underneath their lino and at the bottom of the stumps? They used to dig holes underneath a certain stump in the house to hide their valuables. They were told by the government at the time, you know, the Japanese might invade. You know, they drew the Brisbane line just under Gympie to say, you know, anybody above Gympie should move immediately, you know, if you don't want to be invaded by the Japanese, and everybody hide your goods. So we thought maybe this had been happening during the war and they never quite got over it. And we also had to look into, you know, what was happening at Queensland Rail at the time, what people were earning, and where could they have been getting all this money from, where excess cash. So someone worked out that there had, war bonds were involved, so we had to do a whole bunch of research about war bonds and bank bonds and things. And pension rules. Why do you think, I've mentioned the account balances a couple of times, why do you think pension rules were important?
Well, if you let too much money build up in the bank account, then they'll guarantee your pension back according to the balance.
Absolutely.
So, and they do it even today, they keep taking it out.
That's right, and you have to redistribute and give to different people. And so you've got Arthur and Eleanor's account, and Eleanor's account were capped at about £500, remember? And which was anything over £500, the bank would start shearing off your pension. So that was a really amazing discovery for us. It's like, oh, okay, so why do you think the third bank book was deposits only? That's where we come down to.
That's the money that was being taken out.
Exactly, right? So we think that possibly Eleanor had made a third account. It was at a different bank in South Brisbane, so we found out all about banking in the Times. Everybody knew their bank manager back then, so if Eleanor had made a dodgy account, then if she goes to her own bank, then, you know, they would know. Morgan worked for the Commonwealth Bank, their son, so for a while there we thought maybe Morgan was, you know, complicit, but he was very straight-laced and there was nothing to suggest that he had anything to do with it. And then, just before I published this book, actually right at the end of last year, somebody came and told us he had worked in the railways with Arthur, and he's in his early 90s, this fellow. He said, I've been hearing about this project that you've been working on, and he said, I used to work with Arthur Webster, and he said, and I remember a conversation when I was working for him as his fireman. He was skiting about his old man. His old man had found out that the new 4X brewery, which is just behind our house, had started selling shares, okay? And that he asked Arthur's dad had asked him to go and buy some shares for him at this brewery thing. Think that beer's going to go somewhere, son. And Arthur had taken his dad's money and he'd gone and bought shares. And then his dad died. But Arthur had bought the shares in Arthur's name, not his father's name. So he was skiting to the people at work that his old man had died and he still had all these shares, and he sold the shares and he bought himself a new car that he couldn't drive and must have had some excess money. So that came right at the end of the investigations, you know, into what was going on. So, you know, we actually think that that's part of what the extra money was. So, related stories. Oh my goodness, how many related stories do we find, Lynn? Just all the time there were things coming in. You know, people who'd lived in Milton were telling us about all the brothels that were in Milton. And Caylie, maybe your house was a brothel. It was divided into flats. Maybe that they were running a brothel at the front or the back and earning money from that. Somebody then told us her brothel story, fantastic story about, she was reading the newspaper one weekend and she recognised a house that she'd lived in Petrie Terrace, and they'd done up this house, and the guy who'd done it up said, it was really interesting doing the history of the house while I did it up. And I actually, it's really fascinating that it had once been run as a brothel. And Cheryl was reading this article going, well, no, my great-grandfather built that house. And my grandmother lived in that house until she died, and I lived in that house. Hang on, the dates. You're saying that this was run as a brothel while my family was living in it? What? So she contacted them and said, this is slander, I'm not having any of it, you need to show me proof and evidence, which he did. And she then went to her family and went, hey, you guys know how Mum never really used to get on very well with Grandma and that we had all that family disturbance. I think it's because the house was run as a brothel. And Grandma was the brothel owner and blah, blah, blah. And none of her family believed it. And they, to this day, refuse to believe that that was ever the case. So a lot of these stories bring up quite a lot of emotions for people, and they have in the group. We've come across murders, fantastic murders. There was actually, I think there was a Muriel White on our street that was involved in a, was she that lady who, the terminated pregnancy? There was a clinic. There was an abortion clinic on my street, just a few houses up, and we'd found a murder and a murder. The lady who'd run the clinic was charged with murder because the lady she'd terminated the pregnancy had died, and there was the name Muriel White in there. So we're all excited that this is Muriel White, and maybe Eleanor had her bank book, and after she died, then blah, blah, blah. But no, it had nothing to do with that. But the murder stories continued, and the Morecambe family was involved in the murder story, which is very interesting. So we went all the way back in time to, because we started getting so interested about history of not just the people, but the house, we were contacted by people who had done house histories and land histories. And so we went all the way back to the original land titles. So this is Milton Train Line, this is Lang Park, Suncorp Stadium. This is where Forex is here. This is Milton Road. So my house is about here. So this fantastic land sales kind of map shows all these interesting people who were the first people who bought the land in the area. So do you guys know Patrick Mayne? You know the Mayne inheritance story? There's the Cribbs here. Patrick Mayne owned this land here. We've got Payne and Adset, who are very well known, and George Leslie here, who owned these blocks. All of these people in this area were politicians at the time. They were the ones involved in separating Queensland from New South Wales. And they were obviously the ones who had a bit of money and were the first ones to find out about the land divisions and sales. So all these wonderful pieces of land were owned by well-known people, and we were able to track our property all the way back to this fellow George Leslie who bought it. He was a friend of Ludwig Leichhardt's, and there was correspondence that we found between the two. We found out that the old mayor of Toowong had built my house, and it just brought history alive for all of us again. And the children who've been involved in the project have loved it. They are learning about Ludwig Leichhardt in grade 5. I was able to give the kids in schools a letter from Ludwig Leichhardt to the guy who used to own my land. And we're making visits to the state archives, we're going to jails, we're going to museums, we're finding missing headstones and replacing them. We're really opening things up. I am now obsessed with old things. My husband is really cross with me because every few weeks I'll find some other little tidbit, really cheap and bring it home and not know what to do with it. Lino is an obsession, and I've got some here. I'm going to pass it round for you guys. A lady made this lino for me for my book launch, and all old lino, and I bet you there'll be something here that you recognise, so I'll get that passed around. So these sorts of things have become, oops, go away. I take pictures of old cars. Where am I going now? There we go. We'll go back, shall we? No, the other way. All right, so it's gone nuts on social media and on normal media. We've had so much interest. These are the Morecambe brothers up here, so Daniel Morecambe's uncle and father, who are involved in the story. Radio and TV people. I did a TEDx Brisbane talk about this amazing thing that we've done as a community, and I was on Conversations last week talking about what it's all about. And I can't stress enough that none of this project has actually been about the bank book or the money. What it's been about is a community of people who've come together to do the investigation. So these guys were, you know, up until the moment I put the picture up on Facebook, some people were doing their own family investigations, you know, interested to look at old nostalgic pictures, but really quite passive, you know, looking at these things and making general comments. But by turning this into a community sleuthing project, we were able to bring in heaps of people in the community who may have become disconnected from one another for whatever reason, and using social media to pull knowledge and to bring them all together. We all learned how to use all the different techniques. In the back of the book, there's actually a whole chapter on how to do your own family research, how to do your own house history research, and so on. There's a website that the local Brisbane Council has funded for me to share stories of what's happened and other people's stories. So that's what we're doing this year, is as other people share their stories that are either related to the under the Lino phenomenon or their own family history discoveries, we're uploading those onto the webpage. And the book. So the book in itself was quite phenomenal. Halfway through maybe a month into the project, I am a writer. I have been a writer for my whole life, and I was doing summaries about what had been happening and sharing all of this stuff. And someone said, "Gosh, Caylie, this is so interesting, it should be made into a book." And I was like, "Oh, really? Oh God, that's a big task." But yeah, I agree, it's a good story. But I'm not going to have it traditionally published because it could take 5 years to get this in front of the right person. And I will self-publish it, but I can't afford to do it by myself. So the community agreed to crowdfund it. So 350 odd people pre-ordered a copy of the book before I had even written, you know, in the beginning. And in 6 weeks, they funded enough money for me to write and publish the book that is right there now. So, and it's a mixture of anecdotes and stories that are, and other people's opinions and ideas, and it's done, you know, very, very well in Brisbane and Australia, and it's, you know, it's really getting people to do their own investigations now. I think that's the biggest value of it. And this is my mate Matthew Condon, do you guys know Matt Condon? He's written quite a lot of books about Brisbane and the history of Brisbane, and the Fitzgerald Inquiry's got some big books about that out. So he loved it. He loved this book because he loves Brisbane history and the history of Ipswich and Maryborough and the surrounds. And we're about to do the second print run of the book, and he's put this lovely blurb on the back of the book for the second print run. And just to reiterate with you that this project has really got nothing to do with the money. I could have found an old whiskey bottle in the backyard. I could have found a whole bunch of things. Everybody finds something in their houses or their properties or their grandmother's house. Everyone has keepsakes at home they probably don't know much about. And it's what actually we all as a community did with these products that made it the project that it is. So, you know, making sure that in the community online, we answered each other's questions. You know, sometimes you'll put something on a post on Facebook or on online social media. You might read a fantastic article and write, oh, that was a great article, that really resonated with me and I really felt for your position. And no one ever writes back to you because the author of the article might be too busy or not really know how to run it. We never let that happen in this group. Anytime anybody said anything, even if it was really stupid, you know, and there were some very stupid comments and, you know, people who hadn't read what we'd done or they're new to the group and hadn't done any, you know, pre-reading or anything, they're sort of jumping in and saying, you know, oh, maybe this, and we're like, oh God, we're going to have to, you know. and Lynn, you know, copped a fair number of those comments, but we have managed them well and we've taken care of the people in the group and we've really looked after them. And yeah, so I think that turning people into active participants rather than passengers has been the real value of this, and getting them to do their own research. And I've even had a few people say to me lately, so, you know, what's next? What are we going to do next? And I'm personally messaging those people and saying, I've taught you how to fish. We've taught you how to fish. Go do your fishing. This is your turn now to go and do your own, you know, research. Don't keep coming back to the group expecting, you know, us to feed you all the time. And so while there's still ongoing investigations sort of trickling in the background, we really have been pushing people to go and do their own thing. And I would just put that out to all of you today. If you've got things at home, if you've got old photographs or family keepsakes, if you've got grandchildren or children that you think might appreciate some of the stuff that you have, write stories about some of those things. If it's your great-grandmother's special tea set, you know, because once you guys aren't here anymore, my generation will be bequeathed some of this stuff and have absolutely no idea of the value of it to you. And it'll end up in St Vincent de Paul's, which I think is so sad. I see things in sort of these old shops all the time and think, whose necklace was that? Or whose engagement ring was that? Who wore those things? Wouldn't it be nice if everything came with a story? So yeah, that's how I would encourage you guys to continue after today. And really open the floor to questions now, but thank you for having me today. I hope you've got something out of this talk. Yeah, any questions for me?